Alrighty guys, hello and welcome back to the show. A long time ago, we looked at Tech 2 artillery, accuracy, damage levels, etc. And today we're gonna look at Tech 3 artillery, but we're gonna go deeper. Way below the waves into the FAF mechanics using the 2 years of science videos that I painstakingly put together for your benefit. And with that in mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. And with that, let's roll the intro. All right, to kick things off, I'll throw a screenshot of the basic stats on the screen. I'm not going to read all of them, but some notable callouts that I believe will make a difference in the matchup are Disruptors are the cheapest of the lineup and have the highest fire rate. Emissary has the highest DPS, but the slowest fire rate. And the Duke and Hovatham are in the middle of the road with fire rate, DPS, and overall cost. It should also be noted that I do write my scripts in kind of a waterfall format, I guess. So I don't do all my testing and then write the script. I kind of write the script as I'm doing my testing. So those are some of my initial considerations as I was writing this script. Next, let's look at performance against shields. So this is the most important metric to look at. And really, whenever I mean shields, I mean it's going to bombard a base that I set up. Y'all can see the base on the screen. The base is not necessarily 100% realistic, and that doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that I use the same base in the same position or pretty close for every single test, because that is the most important thing. So yes, if you have T1 land factories and a T1 air factory married with T3 power generators, you're probably doing something wrong, but that's okay, because all we're doing here is testing the actual artillery. Now, a few months ago, I casted one of the best games I think I've ever casted, with a really epic artillery battle between several high-rated players. So check that out if you want to see some of the big boys slug it out with the big toys. I'll link that cast down in the description below. For our results, going up against the base that we threw together, this is going to tell us a couple of different things. First is artillery accuracy and the overall effect of said accuracy. Second, we're going to look at how damage versus fire rate translates to success. So this should be a really good look at how long-range artillery performs in its primary purpose, which is bombarding a base. Again, this is probably why you should be using these. It shouldn't be to kill experimentals. They're never going to kill experimentals. They're not good for that. Their minimum range is like obscenely large. I think it's like 2.5 kilometers or something like that. So you need to be bombarding a base with these. And if you're not, take this as a word of advice. Okay, so let's look at the results. Now, for the first one, we're going to look at the Aeon. After waiting for 2 emissaries to try and kill the base for about 15 minutes and only watching them get through some of the shields, but lacking the fire rate to capitalize before the others flip back on, I gave up on this one. I verified it a couple different times. I tried different targeting methods. The just 2 emissaries is not gonna cut it against this base, which is a little bit disappointing. The 2 Dukes, however, were able to eat through the shields and the base in about 1 minute and 28 seconds. The increased fire rate, even though they have lower damage per second, allows them to penetrate the shields and do significant damage on the base on the first volley. The Hovathams were also able to cut through the shields and destroy the base, but it took them a little bit longer at 2 minutes and 20 seconds. This can be attributed to not only its slightly lower damage per second, but also larger firing randomness. And let's throw the stats back up on the screen here. But firing randomness essentially is the accuracy metric within Fortune Alliance Forever. So if you have higher firing randomness, it means that your shots are going to be more random and not be quite as accurate. So a lot of units that you see, like tanks and things like that, will have 0 firing randomness, or just it won't even be listed in the FAF database, or it'll be infinitesimally small. For things like artillery that are very, very long range and that have kind of a historical story of accuracy issues, if you look back to World War I, where artillery was a huge deal, the accuracy of those artillery installations was largely hand calculated. So the people at Gas Power Games and the devs at Fortune Alliance Forever have sought to mimic that within our own kind of world that we are playing in, so to speak. So larger firing randomness means worse performance, if we're going to put it in a nutshell. Lastly, we have the Cybrin with the highest fire rate, but the lowest overall DPS and also the worst accuracy. But the Cybrin are able to put up a very respectable 1 minute 34 seconds to kill off the base, putting it in striking distance of the Duke themselves. So my initial theory is that the best thing here is fire rate. Second to that is going to be accuracy. So we have the Cybrin at the highest fire rate. The Duke and the Hovatham share the same fire rate, but the Duke has better accuracy, which means that I think that the Duke is going to be more effective than the Hovatham. And then lastly, the Emissary has the highest damage and accuracy, but its fire rate is very poor and doesn't allow it to capitalize on shield failures. These were my initial results and initial theories. So now let's put them a little bit more to the test. Like I said, I write these scripts in much more of a waterfall kind of process where I'm writing this as I'm actually running my testing. So using my new statistical analysis techniques taught to me by a combination of an awesome viewer and my brother, whose day job is in data science and machine learning, being patient enough to answer my monkey brain questions, we can quantify the significance or lack thereof of my initial results. So after running a battery of tests across the board, I ran 7 tests for each faction. Aeon doesn't change. Aeon still really struggles getting through the shields. But after running some more in-depth testing, which took a hell of a long time, it's looking like the data is partially supporting my initial theory or my original thesis. So the bar and whisker chart is definitely supporting it, but the two-way ANOVA analysis is inconclusive. So take from that what you will. Essentially what the bar and whisker chart does, if you're not familiar, you didn't watch my static AA video, that's okay. The bar and whisker chart essentially shows me where the concentration of results are and then any outliers. And then the ANOVA analysis is a way of comparing two sets of results and seeing if one is more statistically significant to the other. So the bar and whisker chart does show a little bit of a difference, but the ANOVA results are a little bit inconclusive. If you want a more detailed breakdown on what ANOVA tells you, check out my video on static AA. I gave a little bit more expanded explanation in that particular video. But let's just say that one particular way of looking at the data supports my initial theory. The other one does not. So the results that we see here tell us one thing. Even though the Aeon have a higher DPS, their fire rate is really hurting their efficacy against shields and gives nested shields an opportunity to recharge and reset. That's probably the most important takeaway here. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more subjective, but I believe that the data also points to that fire rate ultimately in Tech 3 artillery reigns supreme, and that accuracy is a secondary consideration. And lastly, we look at damage, and I believe that this is your final consideration, a tertiary consideration, so to speak. And whenever you only have 4 factions and you're looking at damage, then as a tertiary consideration, then it's pretty much on the back burner. So I think that if we are deciding on a faction that does the best in a Tech 3 artillery land war, it's going to be the Cybrin here, because I believe fire rate is so far the determining factor, and that accuracy is the secondary consideration, and lastly is overall damage. Now, we're going to move to a different subject here. Instead of overall efficacy, there's one other consideration whenever you are comparing these 3 factions. I'll throw the stats up on the screen again. But the other one is build power requirements as they relate to mass and what it means for construction time. Now, Tech 3 artillery, very large investment, regardless of which faction you're going with. But build power is a number in FAF that, in conjunction with mass cost, dictates how much mass it costs for an engineer to build something per second, and then how fast it gets built. So I'm not exactly sure what the exact calculation was that is run on the back end, but essentially what happened was I ran several tests. And if we look at the Disruptor as an example, it has a mass cost of 69,600. This is so close to a very nice number, but you know, I'll forgive the devs that. And it costs a build power of 105,000. Now, an engineer has a build rate of 30. So 105,000 divided by 30 equals 3,500. this is how many seconds it takes for one T3 engineer to build a disruptor or a T3 artillery for the Cybrin. Now, it takes nearly an hour for one engineer to build a Tech 3 artillery without any mass constraints, which is why you always should assign multiple engineers to build your artillery. But now, if we look at the mass cost of 69,600 and divide it by 3,500, that gives us 19.9 mass per second. But it appears to be getting rounded down in the UI, as the UI only displays 19 mass for the engineer. But I can verify this with 10 engineers applying 300 build power. It takes a little under 6 minutes to complete. So they are actually applying 19.9 mass per second, even though the UI is only displaying 19 mass per second. Again, you can refer back to another video that I made, which is on power generator and mechs adjacency. I'll link it down in the description below if you're curious as to how variables get handled by programs and why there is this discrepancy between what's in the UI and what's handled by the variables themselves. And I thought it was interesting. Some people thought it was stupid, but it's okay. I thought it was interesting. So I'll link it down in the description below if you're interested in that. But moral of the story here is that what is displayed in the UI is an approximation of the actual calculations that are going on in the background in the actual game engine. So now there is a point to any of this, but for anyone who doesn't know how build power works in FAF, I wanted to give a really quick approximation of how it works. And this is admittedly a very basic explanation, but I thought it would be a good refresher. Now, as I was reviewing the stats for the 4 factions, I noticed that the build power requirements and mass cost were not linear. So the disruptor versus the emissary has a roughly 5% increase in mass cost for the emissary, but there is a 15% increase in overall build power cost. Now, so what this means is that an emissary costs less mass per second to produce than a disruptor does, but takes 50 seconds longer to construct. Even though it costs more mass, there is less mass that is applied per second per engineer to an emissary than there is to a disruptor. Now, this can be a pretty big deal in scenarios, even in scenarios with unlimited mass like this one, as the first couple shots from a hostile artillery can ruin your day. So if there is a disruptor on the other side of the screen, it completes 50 seconds sooner than your emissary. That means that disruptor gets 3 to 4 shots off before your emissary actually completes, which means that your emissary is vulnerable without even being able to fire back. Now, when you're mass stalling, as you often will be when building Tech 3 artillery, I would imagine that this discrepancy can be exacerbated, because if you're stalling more than your opponent is in terms of overall mass cost, it means that it's going to take you exponentially longer to complete an emissary than it will for somebody stalling the same amount of mass to complete a disruptor, which is a huge problem. So that was something interesting that I found out in my testing as it relates to build power requirements and the mass requirements. Is even in scenarios of unlimited mass, it can take 10 engineers about 16% longer to build an emissary than it will to build a disruptor. So in closing, I can already hear y'all whenever I run into you on Discord, and you'll say something like, hey, I think your results are a little bit skewed towards Cybrin because that's your favorite faction. And you're right. It is my favorite faction, and that's okay. I'm allowed to have favorite factions. But I encourage anyone to test these things as well if you want to take the time and prove me wrong. A bunch of y'all did that on my T1 point defense video, and that is fucking awesome that you guys took the time to actually put in some testing time and prove me wrong. And this is awesome because it means that y'all care about this game as much as I do. And even if that proves me wrong, I consider that as a win, which is why I've pinned comments at the bottom of my Tech 1 point defense video saying, hey, this information is outdated, don't pay attention to it, etc. But if you want to watch it because you just really want to hear me ramble, then go for it. But now getting to the ranking is pretty simple. Cybrin, I think, takes the cake here. Fire rate reigns supreme. The Duke then edges out the Hovatham for second because of the better accuracy, although this is pretty slight. I think that both of these guys pretty much traded blows, but I think that the Duke was very slightly more consistent than the Hovatham. And then the Emissary sits in last because of its very poor fire rate, and its inability to even complete the test. So its inability to complete the test, I feel like, is pretty damning whenever you want to advocate for a particular faction. So with that, thank you all so much for watching. Consider liking and subscribing the video if you haven't already, and I will see y'all in the next one. Peace.